Hey everyone, tonight we're going back, and I mean really back to a world where nothing went to waste, where a cracked bar of soap got pressed into a new bar, where bacon grease lived in a coffee can on the back of the stove like a trusted member of the household, and where the women who ran those households knew things about making a dollar stretch that would genuinely impress you if anyone had thought to write them down. Tonight we have got a full evening ahead. We will spend time inside the actual daily routines of a Depression-era mother navigating her kitchen and her household in ways that are both humbling and, if you look closely, quietly magnificent. Then we're going to follow the story of Procter & Gamble and the Great Shortening Wars of the 1930s, which is a real thing that happened and is far more dramatic than it sounds. After that, we will step inside the life of a laundress, not the romantic version you might imagine, but the actual version, with its hours and its heat and its small specific satisfactions. And finally, we're going to look at the part of Depression-era thrift that the cheerful magazine spreads never showed. The emotional cost of scarcity, what it did to women's bodies, their relationships, their sense of self, and what they carried forward long after the lean years were technically over. So before you get settled, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy spending time here. And leave me a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is wherever you are. I love seeing that. Now get comfortable, maybe pull a blanket up, and let us go back together. You wake up before the house does. That is the rule, though no one ever wrote it down, and you didn't need them to. The kitchen is cold in a way that reaches through your nightgown before you even reach the doorway, and the first thing you do, the very first thing, before coffee, before thought, before you have fully assembled yourself into a person capable of facing a Tuesday, is check the stove. You open the firebox and look. There are coals in there still, a few of them, orange at the centre with grey feathering around the edges, and you feed them carefully because wasting kindling on a fire that did not need to start from scratch is exactly the kind of thing you no longer do. You add a small piece of wood, not a large one, you wait. The coals accept it. You close the door. The kitchen in the early morning of 1934, or 1936, or 1938, because the years blur together in their demands, even if not in their particulars, smells of wood smoke and cold grease, and something faintly sour from the bread you started yesterday. The linoleum under your feet is the kind of cold that feels personal, the kind that travels straight up through your heel and into your spine, and you have long since learned to keep your shoes near the bedroom door for exactly this reason. You put them on in the dark, by feel. You know where everything is in the dark. You have learned the shape of this life the way a blind woman learns a room, by moving through it until the obstacles stop surprising you. You fill the kettle, not from the tap because the tap this time of year runs slow and cold and sometimes not at all, but from the pitcher you filled last night and left on the counter. Planning ahead is not something you think of as a skill anymore. It is simply the way you move through time. You think a day ahead, sometimes two, sometimes a week, the way a card player thinks about the hand they are not yet holding. The kettle goes on the stove. You listen to it. The sound it makes when it begins to warm is a small domestic reassurance, a low metallic settling, and you stand near it for a moment because the stove is the warmest place in the house, and you're allowed this much. Breakfast is already decided. It was decided last night when you looked at what was in the pantry and calculated forward. You have oatmeal, half a canister, enough for this morning, and one more if you're careful with the portions. You have a heel of bread that is 1 day past its best but 2 days from being unusable, and that heel is going to become breakfast toast for your husband, because he leaves first and he works on his feet, and he needs something substantial in a way that you and the children who are going to school and sitting down most of the day do not quite require at the same level. You have 2 eggs. You will not use them this morning. You have a plan for those eggs that involves the end of the week, and you are not deviating from it. The oatmeal goes into the pot with water, not milk. Milk is rationed in your household with a precision that would impress an accountant. Milk goes into the children first, a cup each, and into the baby if the baby is still nursing, and after that into anything that genuinely cannot be made without it, and not into oatmeal if water will do the same job. And water does the same job. You have stopped tasting the difference, or rather you have stopped letting yourself taste the difference, which is a subtle and important distinction that you do not have time to examine this morning. You stir the oatmeal, you reduce the heat. You have learned the exact amount of heat this stove requires at this time of morning to cook oatmeal without burning it, and it took you 3 scorched pots to learn it, and the knowledge is now yours permanently. The bread heel goes under the broiler, and you stand near it because a heel of bread under a broiler is not something you can walk away from, not even for a moment, and you have burned enough things to know that the cost of inattention is a cost you cannot afford to keep paying. While you stand there, you begin the list. Not a written list. You are past needing paper for the daily list. The list is in your head, assembled automatically like a morning prayer. What needs doing today? What can wait until tomorrow? What absolutely cannot wait? And what the consequence is of letting it wait anyway. You are running this calculation before the toast has browned. Your husband comes into the kitchen at 10 minutes past 6. You know it is 10 minutes past 6, not because you looked at the clock, but because you know the sound of his footsteps and the time it takes him to dress. And those two pieces of information together tell you the time with a reliability that would surprise anyone who has not learned to read a household the way you have. He takes his toast standing at the counter. You pour him coffee, the real thing still, though you have already decided that when this can runs out, you're going to start stretching it with chicory and see if he notices. He probably will not notice. Men rarely notice the adjustments you make until the adjustments become dramatic, and you're very good at keeping your adjustments incremental. He leaves. You hear the door, and then you hear the particular quiet that a house makes when one person has just left it. A settling, almost a sigh. And then you hear the children, which means the quiet is already over. They come in stages, the oldest first, because she has always been an early riser and has inherited from you the habit of being awake before she's required to be. Then the middle two together, louder, already in some low-grade negotiation about something that does not matter and will not matter by the time they reach school, and finally the youngest, who needs to be collected from his bed like a package and carried to the table because he has not yet learned to want morning the way the rest of you have been forced to. You feed them, oatmeal with a small scraping of brown sugar on top, because deprivation without any sweetness at all is a different kind of poverty, and you are holding that line if you can, and you can still hold that particular line for now. The children eat. You stand at the counter and drink your coffee and eat what is left in the pot, the scrapings, the last of it, which is always slightly gluey in a way that the first serving is not, and you eat it without complaint, internal or external, because complaining requires energy you have already spent on something else. After they leave for school, the house holds a different quality of silence. Not the pre-dawn silence of a sleeping household, which is thick and protective, but the mid-morning silence of a house that has expelled its occupants and is waiting for you to begin. You begin. The dishes first, because dishes left are dishes that attract grease and flies and disorder in a house this small, with this little to work with, compounds quickly into something that takes twice the time to undo. You wash in a basin, not under running water, because running water for dishes is something you are not willing to use if a basin will serve. The water you used yesterday for the final rinse of the dishes you kept overnight and used this morning as the first wash of today's dishes. Nothing is used once if you can manage two uses. The kitchen in these years has a particular geography of frugality that visitors, if you had visitors, might not immediately read, but that you know intimately. The coffee can near the stove is not for coffee. It is for grease, bacon grease and lard, and the fat rendered from chicken skin, whatever fat comes through the kitchen, because that fat is going to be used for frying, for flavouring, for the biscuits on Sunday if Sunday allows for biscuits, and in the lean weeks, that coffee can is the most valuable thing on your stove. You never pour fat down the drain. The drain is for water. Fat is saved, strained through a cloth if necessary, labelled in your mind if not in writing, organised by what cooked it, because bacon grease and chicken fat are not the same thing, and they are not interchangeable in every application. And this knowledge lives in your hands and your nose and your 37 years of life in a kitchen. The soap situation requires attention today. You have a bar of ivory that is down to a thin wedge, not quite unusable but close, and you have been watching it for 3 days, measuring it against how many more days you can get from it before you need to make a decision. Today is the decision day. You take the wedge and you press it firmly against the back of the new bar, the one you have been rationing from the pantry, and you hold the two pieces together for a long moment until the warmth of your hands begins to soften them slightly, and when you release them, they are bonded, not perfectly, not invisibly, but well enough. The soap is now 1 bar again. This is not a trick you read in a magazine. This is something you watched your mother do, and her mother before her, and the information passed between women the way the most useful information always passes, quietly and without ceremony, in the middle of doing something else entirely. You make bread on Tuesdays and Fridays. Today is Tuesday. The starter has been sitting in the cool of the pantry since Sunday when you fed it, and you bring it out now and let it come to room temperature while you measure flour, which you do not measure with a measuring cup but with your palm and your eye, and the knowledge of what the right proportion of flour to starter looks like in this particular bowl. You have made this bread so many times that the recipe is not a recipe anymore. It is a conversation between your hands and the dough, a back and forth that adjusts itself based on how the flour feels today, whether the humidity is high, whether the kitchen has warmed up yet, what the starter did overnight. The dough knows things. You know things. Between the two of you, you usually get a decent loaf. While the dough is rising, you do the mending. The mending basket lives at the end of the kitchen table, and it is never empty, not for long, because a family of 6 generates a continuous and patient stream of small breakages, small worn places, small failures of thread and fabric, and all of them come to this basket and wait for Tuesday and Friday mornings when the bread is rising, and you have 2 hours that belong entirely to needle and thread. You sit at the table. The light at this time of morning comes through the east window in a way that is genuinely useful, low and clear and specific. Good light for seeing where the weave has thinned before it becomes a hole, good light for threading a needle without it taking 3 tries. You prefer this light to any other light in the house. It is your best working light, and you have arranged your tasks around it. The work of mending is not unpleasant. This is something you're aware of in a quiet way that you would not admit in a conversation about hardship, because to admit that you find mending satisfying would seem to romanticize something that is, in its origins, a necessity, and you're not in the business of romance this year. But the truth is that there is something in the smallness and the solubility of the task that the larger demands of the day do not offer. A sock with a hole at the heel becomes a sock without a hole at the heel. The problem is visible, the solution is known, the outcome is certain. You put in the stitches, the hole closes, the sock is returned to service. This is a form of control in a life where control is not always available in the quantities you require. Your thread comes from a collection you've been building for 15 years. Every spool that empties gets wound with whatever thread can be salvaged from worn-out garments before they become rags, which happens only after they become patches, which happens only after they become the garment's 3rd or 4th incarnation since they were new. You have thread in colours that match nothing currently in the mending basket, thread that came from a blue dress that is now a dishcloth that is now 3/4 gone to tatters, and thread from a child's shirt that became a work shirt and then a dust rag, and is now only memory and 3/4 of a green spool. You save it anyway. Thread does not go bad. By 10 o'clock the bread is shaped and resting for its second rise, and the mending basket is half emptied, and the kitchen has warmed to something close to comfortable. This is the hour of the day that belongs to the second tier of tasks, the ones that do not have the urgency of feeding and clothing but that accumulate into catastrophe if they are ignored too long. You have a daughter who needs new soles on her school shoes, and new soles cost money you are managing carefully this month. But there is a man on Garfield Street who does shoe repair and will barter for a loaf of bread, and you have established this arrangement over the past year with a casualness that makes it feel more like friendship than commerce, which is how you prefer these arrangements to feel even when they are entirely practical. The pantry is where you do your best mathematical thinking. You go in now with the mental ledger already running. You have, on the upper shelf, a jar of dried beans that is 3/4 full, a canister of cornmeal that will last through the week if you're careful, a jar of apple butter you put up in October that is one of 7, and 2 cans of tomatoes that you're holding for a moment when everything else runs short and you need something to serve with rice that does not require explanation or apology. Below that, the potatoes, stored in the cool of the lower shelf, which is the coolest part of the pantry because it is nearest the exterior wall, and potatoes are the most reliable thing in the pantry right now, caloric and filling, and capable of being prepared in enough different ways that a week of potato-adjacent meals does not feel like a week of the same meal if you are creative about it. And you are creative about it. You have become extraordinarily creative about it. There is a philosophy of scarcity that you have never named, because naming it would require stepping back from it, and stepping back from it would require admitting that it is a philosophy and not simply life, and some days you need it to simply be life. But it is this. Nothing leaves this kitchen as waste if there is any path that leads it first through usefulness. Potato peels are saved for soup stock. Stale bread becomes bread pudding or croutons or the base of a savoury dish that your children call stuffing, and you call making something out of nothing, which is one of the primary arts of this decade. Wilted vegetables are cooked long in water, with whatever else is wilting, and the result is soup, and the result of that soup, if there is some left at the end of a meal, goes into the icebox and becomes tomorrow's base. Nothing is finished. Everything becomes something else. The icebox. You check it the way a doctor checks a patient, with a practiced eye that reads the contents not just for what is there, but for what is beginning to turn, and what can still be used, and what must be used today, and what is already gone, though you rarely let anything get to gone without intercepting it somewhere in the progression. There is cold beef from Sunday, enough for 2 sandwiches, and a piece of cornbread from yesterday, and a half jar of rendered lard sealed with a cloth, and a bowl of egg yolks you separated from something you were making and saved because egg yolks can always be used for something, and throwing an egg yolk away would be the kind of extravagance that would have made your mother physically uncomfortable to witness. You take the beef. You begin to plan the sandwiches. This is the middle of the day, already thinking about the end of the day, already living 2 meals ahead. Dinner in these years is a creative problem with a strict budget. You're not an uncreative cook, and this is not a modest statement, it is simply accurate. You have learned from necessity what the trained cooks learn from school, that fat is flavour, that low heat is patience, that acid brightens everything, that bread binds, that a small amount of the right thing is always preferable to a large amount of the wrong thing. You know how to make a small piece of meat feed 6 people, which involves the meat being secondary to the things around it, which involves the things around it being so well seasoned and so carefully cooked that the meat becomes almost incidental, almost a guest at its own dinner rather than the host. Your children will remember these dinners as good dinners. You know this in the same quiet, certain way that you know the stove's temperament. You're not certain of many things, but you are certain of that. By the time the afternoon comes in properly, heavy and slow, the bread has been baked and is cooling on the rack, and the smell of it fills the house in a way that would be sentimental if you allowed it to be. You do not allow it to be. You allow it to simply be bread cooling, which is what it is, which is a thing that is needed and that you have produced with your own hands, out of materials that cost almost nothing, and a knowledge that cost years, and that is enough. More than enough, really. You cut a heel from the new loaf and eat it standing at the counter, which is the cook's privilege, and the bread is good, and you know it is good, and you eat it without ceremony or comment, which is the only ceremony you have for the small, reliable pleasures of your own competence. The afternoon belongs to the week's accounting. Not dramatic accounting, not crisis accounting, but the steady, unexciting maintenance of knowing exactly where things stand. You have a small notebook, bought with a nickel and kept for 2 years, in which you write the week's spending, each entry small and precise, each column adding up to a total that must not exceed a number you set at the beginning of every month when you and your husband sit at this same table and negotiate the reality of the month ahead. The notebook is not about shame. It is not about pride. It is a navigation tool, the same way a ship's log is a navigation tool, because without it you drift. And drifting in these years is how families end up in a place they cannot come back from, and you are not going to that place. Late afternoon brings the children home and the house expands back into its full register of noise and need and small emergencies. There is a skinned knee that needs attention. There is a dispute about homework that requires adjudication. There is the youngest wanting to be held and the oldest wanting to be left alone, and both of these things are true and both of them are valid, and you are required to hold both of them simultaneously, while also beginning dinner and also keeping track of the bread you need to save for tomorrow, and also remembering that the beans you put to soak this morning need to be checked for their doneness, because beans that are not quite cooked are beans that cause trouble in ways that are specific and unpleasant, and you have enough trouble without adding beans to the list. Dinner comes together the way dinner always comes together in a kitchen like this one, by which you mean through a kind of practiced alchemy that looks effortless from the outside but is never effortless on the inside. It is economy disguised as abundance. It is the beans made savoury with the pork fat from the coffee can, and the last of the onion, and a long slow heat that turns cheap ingredients into something that fills a kitchen with a smell that is hard to argue with. It is the cornbread, made fast and baked hot, ready in 20 minutes if the oven cooperates, which it usually does if you know how to manage it, which you do. It is the cold beef sliced thin and served alongside rather than as the centre, which means there is enough for everyone and a little more than enough, which is the closest thing to luxury that this kitchen currently offers, and which you have decided to treat as luxury, because the decision to find something luxurious is available even when the thing itself is not. Your husband comes home as the table is being set. He washes his hands at the kitchen sink, which is the ritual that marks the transition from outside to inside, from his world to yours, though you know that these two worlds are not as separate as the washing of hands implies, that the trouble of one leaks into the other constantly, and that some nights the hands take longer to wash than others. Tonight he is quiet in the way that is tired rather than troubled, and you know the difference, and this is the tired kind, which is manageable. You set the food on the table, the family sits, there is a grace, brief and familiar, the same words every night, words that have become as rhythmic and involuntary as breathing, but which carry, at least for you, a genuine weight tonight, because the table is full, and this week it is full, and that is not nothing. After dinner you wash the dishes again, and put the leftovers away with their proper covers and their proper places in the icebox, and sweep the floor, not because the floor is dramatically dirty, but because a swept floor at the end of a day is the visual equivalent of a period at the end of a sentence, a completion, a closure, a small legible sign that this thing was tended. Then you sit. This is the hour that belongs to you, between the children's bedtime and your own, which is usually no more than an hour and sometimes less, but which you protect with a firmness that would surprise anyone who observed how little you protect anything else for yourself throughout the day. You sit near the stove because the stove is still warm. You have a cup of tea made from a bag that you have already used once this afternoon, and will use a third time in the morning. The tea is pale, it is warm, it is yours. The notebook comes out one more time, you add today's numbers, you balance the column, you look at what is left of the week and what still needs to come from it, and you make the adjustments, small ones, the kind that never feel dramatic in the moment, that accumulate quietly into a life that works, that is solvent, that does not crack under the ordinary pressure of feeding and clothing and keeping 6 people warm and alive and loved, which is the work, the actual work, the work that has no title and no wage and no formal acknowledgement, and which you are going to do again tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that. You close the notebook. You put your cup in the basin to wash in the morning. You bank the stove carefully, just enough air, just enough fuel to keep a coal alive through the night so that tomorrow morning there will be something to start from. Because starting from nothing is always possible, but starting from something is always better. And you have learned to hold on to the something when you have it. You go to bed. The house is quiet. Outside, somewhere in the particular darkness of a mid-decade American night, the economy is doing what it has been doing for years, which is something between managing and failing, and there is very little you can do about that, and you have made your peace with the portion of the world you do not control. What you control is the kitchen, the pantry, the notebook, the coffee can on the back of the stove, the bread that is cooling on the rack, wrapped in a clean cloth ready for tomorrow. These things you control, these things you have built day by day into a system that works, that holds, that has not yet broken under the weight of a decade that has broken harder things than this. You lie down, the coals in the stove settle, the house breathes around you. You are, if not at peace, then at rest, which tonight is close enough. There is a particular relationship to time that the Depression-era housewife has that later generations of women will not quite replicate, and it is not simply the relationship of busyness, though busyness is certainly present. It is the relationship of a person whose time is not segmented into work time and personal time and leisure time, in the way that the 20th century will eventually come to understand time, but who experiences the whole of the waking day as a single continuous field of responsibility from which specific tasks arise and into which they are completed, and in which the distinction between what you are doing for the household and what you're doing for yourself is often not a meaningful distinction at all. You cook because you are hungry, and because the family is hungry. You mend because the garments need mending, and because you need the garments to be mended. You tend the garden because the garden will feed you. The line between selfishness and service, which the moral culture of the era drew with a particular firmness, and usually to the disadvantage of women's own needs, is in the lived experience of this household management almost impossible to locate. Not because you are self-sacrificing in the dramatic sense, but because the categories themselves dissolve in the particular solution of this particular life. The almanac is on the kitchen shelf, not the recipe shelf, but the working shelf, the shelf where the practical reference materials live, the shelf you reach for when you need to know whether the next 3 days will permit outdoor laundry, or whether the almanac's weather indications suggest keeping the wash inside. You trust the almanac with the same qualified confidence with which you trust all the predictive tools available to you, which is to say, with an understanding that they are useful guides rather than guarantees, that the weather will do what it will do, and your task is to plan as intelligently as possible and to adapt when the plan meets reality, and the reality is different from what the plan expected. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The almanac is also on the shelf because you read it, not only for weather but for the planting calendar, for the frost dates, for the particular combination of folklore and observation that it represents, which is the same combination of folklore and observation that you apply to your own kitchen practice and which you find more reliable on the whole than theory ungrounded in experience. The cost of food is something you carry in your head at all times, not as anxiety but as information, the way a navigator carries the coordinates of the hazards in the water as information rather than terror. You know what eggs cost this week and what they cost last month, and you know the gap between them, and you know whether the gap suggests a trend or a fluctuation, because the gap matters differently depending on whether it is a trend or a fluctuation. A trend requires a change in your behaviour, a substitution, an adjustment. A fluctuation requires patience. You have learned to distinguish them, imperfectly but usefully, and the distinguishing is another form of the skill that this life has produced in you, the skill of reading information that is not presented as information, of understanding the market for eggs as a form of communication about conditions that affect your household, whether or not anyone intends to communicate them to you. There is a skill that runs beneath all the other skills of this kitchen life, a skill so foundational that the women who possess it rarely think to call it a skill, any more than a carpenter calls measuring a skill, any more than a driver calls steering. It is the skill of seeing forward in time, not forward in the dramatic sense, not the crystal ball kind of forward, but the ordinary domestic forward, the ability to look at a raw potato in October and see it becoming soup in February, to look at the last of the summer tomatoes on the counter and see them in a jar on the shelf in January when fresh things are expensive and increasingly unavailable. You have this skill. You've had it so long that you have forgotten the period of your life when you did not have it. When time in the kitchen moved only in one direction, from purchase to use, without the middle passage of preservation and storage that now defines the rhythm of your year. The canning is autumn work, though its effects reach into every other season. You put up this year 47 quarts of various vegetables and fruits, not because 47 is a target you selected, but because that is what the garden produced, and what you could get at the roadside stand for a reasonable price, and what the shelf in the pantry will hold when arranged properly, which is to say with the most recently made toward the front, because organisation is a form of economy too, because a jar that gets pushed to the back and forgotten is a jar that represents wasted effort and wasted food and wasted money, and none of those categories is something you waste. The canning jars themselves have a history. Some of them are 10 years old, some of them are 15, bought when the household was new and the pantry was being stocked for the first time. You inspect every one before use, running your finger around the rim to feel for chips, holding each jar up to the window light to check for cracks, because a compromised jar is a seal that fails, and a seal that fails is a jar of spoiled food that you will not discover until you open it in the middle of winter when you are counting on it, which is precisely the kind of discovery you cannot afford and will not make if the inspection is thorough. The lids you replace each year, because lids are cheap and failures are not, and this is a calculation you made once and never revisited. You learned to can from your mother, who learned from hers. The knowledge is not written down anywhere you own. It lives in your hands, in the judgment you apply to the texture of a tomato at the moment it is ready to put up, in the specific sound a jar makes when the seal takes properly, a soft pop, a small domestic click that means the vacuum is formed and the contents are safe. When you hear that sound, multiplied across the 47 jars ranged on the counter, in the late summer heat of your kitchen, something eases in you. It is not drama. It is not triumph. It is the quiet satisfaction of a problem solved before it becomes a problem, of provision made in the season of plenty against the season of scarcity, and the sound of those seals taking is the sound of your household's winter not being hungry. The garden is part of this system. Not a large garden, not a beautiful garden, not the kind of garden that appears in magazine photographs with organised rows and charming markers. Your garden is a working garden, arranged for yield rather than aesthetics, for the amount of food it can produce relative to the amount of ground it occupies, which is a small backyard lot that has to share its space with the clothesline and the children's play area and the ash pile from the stove. You grow what keeps and what produces heavily, and what the family will actually eat, not the fancy things, not the varieties that require special attention, but beans and tomatoes and squash and the particular variety of potato that overwinters well in the cool of the pantry. The garden does not have names, it has functions. Your husband digs in spring and you plant and you both weed, and the children are supposed to weed, but their weeding is aspirational rather than systematic and requires supervision, which you provide on Saturday mornings when you bring the whole family into the yard and make the weeding into a thing that has an endpoint, a visible goal, a before and after that children can understand as progress. The children do not love this. You did not love it either, at their age. But love is not the point of weeding. Execution is the point of weeding, and they execute it adequately under supervision, which is more than adequately in the current circumstances. The neighbourhood has its own economy, one that runs parallel to the money economy, and that supplements it in ways that would be difficult to account for in any formal ledger. You know which woman on the street makes superior jelly, and you know which one has a sauce for eggs at better than grocery prices, and you know which family has a husband who is currently employed, and which family is managing on savings, and which family is quietly not managing at all, and will accept a loaf of bread if it is offered as a gift rather than as charity, because the distinction matters, because the line between gift and charity is the line between dignity and its absence, and everyone on this street is navigating that line every day. You exchange things, not formally, not with any accounting of the exchange, but with the kind of easy reciprocity that comes from a neighbourhood of women who understand each other's situations with the precision of people who are living through the same thing. Your neighbour to the left makes quilts from scraps and you do not, and she has offered to make one from your scraps in exchange for a standing arrangement regarding surplus garden produce in summer, and you have accepted this arrangement without discussing it as an arrangement, because to discuss it formally would be to make it transactional in a way that changes its nature, and you both understand this implicitly, the way you understand most of the neighbourhood's social protocols implicitly, which is to say by having lived among people who are all practising the same careful maintenance of dignity under pressure. The women on this street talk to each other through fences and over back steps and at the grocery store and after church, and the talk is partly social and partly informational and partly the ongoing maintenance of a collective awareness of how things stand for everyone, because knowing how things stand for everyone is a form of mutual protection, a way of catching someone before they fall too far, of knowing when to offer the bread that is a gift rather than charity, of knowing when something has crossed from manageable to urgent and requires a different kind of response. You're good at this kind of knowing. You've been good at it your whole adult life. It is one of the skills of neighbourhood life that no one names as a skill, that runs invisibly through the social fabric of every street like yours in every city and town in the country. The grocery store requires strategy. You do not go to the grocery store without knowing exactly what you intend to purchase and exactly what you intend to spend, because the grocery store is a place designed to encourage improvisation and impulse, and improvisation and impulse in 1935 are luxuries you cannot reliably afford. You have a list, written in order of the store's layout, because a list written in order of the store's layout is a list you can execute efficiently without backtracking, without the kind of meandering that leads to purchasing things that were not on the list. You go on Thursday afternoons, after the week's main shopping has been done by families with more flexibility, which means the specials are still available and the produce has not yet been fully picked over. You know which canned goods are reliable generics and which require the name brand, a knowledge that was not given to you but that you acquired through a series of specific failures of generic product in specific applications. The generic tomatoes are fine for soup. The generic tomatoes are not fine for anything where the tomato flavour is the primary character of the dish, because their flavour is thin in a way that is perceptible if you know what you are comparing against, and you know what you are comparing against. The generic flour is identical to the name brand. You have done this side by side. The flour cares nothing for its label. The tomatoes do. you purchase accordingly. You use coupons, not all of them, and not slavishly, because a coupon that takes you to a brand you would not otherwise buy is a coupon that has cost you the difference in price even while appearing to save you money. And this is a subtlety that the coupon itself does not explain, that you have to supply yourself from experience and from the habit of calculating the real cost of things rather than their apparent cost. The coupons you use are the ones that align with what you are going to purchase anyway, the ones that make a planned expense slightly less expensive, and you clip them from the newspaper on Sunday and organise them in a small envelope in your purse, and at the checkout, you present them with a matter-of-factness that makes the transaction smooth and ordinary, which is how you prefer all financial transactions to feel. Your body is a working body. This is something you have always known, though the way you know it has changed over the years, deepened from a theoretical to an entirely practical knowledge, the way most knowledge deepens when it is applied consistently over time. Your hands are the most obvious evidence. They are not the hands of someone who uses them lightly. The skin across the knuckles is thicker than it was at 20. The joints register weather in a way that the joints of women whose hands do different work do not. In winter, when the kitchen is cold and the water is cold, and the wash day comes around on its Monday schedule, regardless of the temperature outside, your hands are the first to feel it and the last to recover. You do not spend time thinking about your body in the way that women in a different kind of life might. You do not have the luxury of a relationship to your physical self that involves observation from a comfortable distance. Your body is the instrument with which you perform the work, and the work is continuous and physical and demanding, and the relationship is therefore one of management rather than contemplation. You manage the fatigue. You manage the recurring soreness in the lower back that appears every Monday and most Tuesdays, and periodically any day on which the work is heavier than usual. You manage the headaches that come when the water is short and you have not drunk enough of it, which happens more often than it should because drinking enough water is another thing the day requires that the day does not always provide the time to do. Sleep is negotiated. 8 hours is a figure from a different life, a life with different demands on the early morning and the late evening, a life in which the hours between 10 and 6 belonged unambiguously to rest. Your hours between 10 and 6 are hours that rest shares with the baby. If the baby is waking, with the child who is not well. If a child is not well, with the mental accounting that your mind insists on running in the dark, even when you have told it to stop. With the light anxiety that is the constant low-level background of a household running on a limited budget through a decade that has offered very little reassurance that things are going to be significantly better soon. You sleep in pieces. You rest in pieces. You accumulate the rest you get rather than sleeping it all at once, and the accumulation is enough to function on most of the time. The body's needs and the day's demands are in perpetual negotiation, and the negotiation is not always fair. There are days when the body requires rest that the day has not scheduled, when the tiredness is not the ordinary tiredness that coffee and movement can address, but the deeper tiredness that requires actual horizontal stillness and actual sleep, and that does not accept any substitute. On those days, you negotiate. You move what can be moved. You cut what can be cut. You find the 30 minutes in the afternoon when the baby is sleeping and the older children are at school, and you lie down, not in your bedroom because that is too far from the kitchen and too far from what needs watching, but on the sitting room sofa in your clothes, and you close your eyes, and you sleep for exactly as long as the situation allows, which is rarely as long as you need and always longer than nothing. Winter changes the rhythm. Not the fundamental rhythm, not the bones of the day, but the texture of it, the specific problems it presents and the specific resources it offers. In winter, the cold is a presence in the house that requires constant management, coal and wood carefully allocated, the stove kept at a level that keeps the family warm without exhausting the supply before the next delivery can be arranged, the drafts plugged with rags at the windows and the door bottoms, the heavy curtains pulled across the glass in the evenings to hold what warmth has been generated inside the room, rather than losing it through the glass to the winter air. Winter is the season that makes visible all the work you do in other seasons to prepare for it. The root vegetables in the pantry are winter's particular resource. The potatoes and the turnips and the carrots stored in the cool dark, the onions hung in their braids from the hook near the pantry door, the dried beans and the canned tomatoes and the preserved everything else. This is what summer's work looks like from the inside of winter. This is the stored season, the deferred summer, and on a February morning when the temperature outside is below freezing, and the grocery store has nothing in it that a Depression-era household can afford at February prices, you reach into the pantry, and the pantry offers up what it has, and what it has is what you put there in August and September and October, when putting things there was the primary task and the system works and the family eats. Summer is the season of abundance and the season of work. They are the same season. The abundance requires the work, because abundance is not self-managing. It spoils, it overripes, it sits on the counter for exactly 3 days in peak condition, and then begins its decline, and the decline is waste, and waste is something you intercept. The garden produces on its own schedule, with no particular attention to yours, and so July and August are months in which the canning and the preserving run alongside the daily kitchen management rather than replacing it, months in which the stove is in near constant use, and the kitchen is very warm, and the jars line the counter in a sequence of completion that is deeply satisfying if you have enough distance from it to feel the satisfaction, which you sometimes do and sometimes do not, depending on how the week has been. Fall is the truest season, if any season can claim that distinction. Fall is when the work of the whole year becomes legible, when the full pantry tells the story of the summer, and the root cellar tells the story of the garden, and the preserves tell the story of the careful hours of August and September, and when all of it together adds up to a winter that the household can sustain without crisis. Fall is the season of the account, of looking at what is there and calculating forward to what will still be there in March, of making adjustments to the plan, of noting where the shortages are going to be and where the surpluses allow for generosity. Fall is when you know how the year is going. Spring is the hardest season in some ways, not because it lacks the beauty it undeniably has, but because it is the end of everything the pantry was supposed to hold, the season of running out, of the canned tomatoes down to the last 2 jars, of the potatoes beginning to sprout in the pantry and needing to be used before they lose too much to the sprouts, of the dried beans nearly gone, and the winter squash soft in its stored spots. Spring is the season of making it to the garden, of enduring the gap between what the pantry has left and what the ground will produce in another 2 months, of managing on what you have managed to get to. Spring is the test of October's preparation. You have not failed this test yet, you do not intend to. You are not an unhappy woman. This is something worth saying clearly, because the accumulation of difficulties, of constraints, of physical demands and financial pressures and perpetual management might suggest a person ground down, worn away, defeated by the conditions of her life. You are not that person. You are a person who has found, through necessity and through the particular adaptations that necessity requires, a life that is structured and purposeful and full of small satisfactions that are real satisfactions, even if they are not the satisfactions of a life arranged differently. You find pleasure in competence. This is perhaps the most honest thing you can say about your relationship to your own life. The well-made bread is a pleasure. The shelf of properly sealed jars is a pleasure. The child who comes in from school looking healthy and reasonably well-dressed and fed is a pleasure of a specific and irrefutable kind, a pleasure that is the direct result of your own efforts and your own skill and your own management, and the knowledge of that connection is not nothing. It is, in fact, a great deal. You find pleasure in the specific textures of the work itself, not always, not every Monday at the washboard, not every evening when the dinner dishes need washing after a long day, but often enough to know that the pleasure is real. There is something in the making of things, in the transformation of raw materials into food and clean clothes and a functioning household, that addresses some need in you that a different kind of life might address differently. You do not have the language for this, and you do not need the language for it. You have the bread rising in the bowl and the beans on the stove and the clean sheets on the line and the notebook balanced in the drawer. These are their own language. They say what they need to say. Your children will not remember your exhaustion. They will remember the bread. They will remember the Sunday dinner. They will remember that the house was warm and the clothes were clean, and that there was always something to eat even in the years when the something was modest. They will remember the specific smell of the kitchen in the mornings, and the specific way the laundry smelled when it came in from the line, and the specific quality of security that a mother who knows what she is doing imparts to a household without ever stating it explicitly. These are the things they will carry forward. The exhaustion, and the rough hands, and the Monday back, and the pale tea, and the thin edge of the butter will be yours and yours alone, invisible to them the way the mechanism of a clock is invisible to someone who only ever looked at the face. There is a story inside every kitchen of that era that most of those kitchens never knew they were telling. A story that lived in the cans and jars on the pantry shelf, in the textures and flavours of what came out of the oven, and in the extraordinary corporate battles being waged in boardrooms and advertising agencies and test kitchens on behalf of the things that homemakers were buying, without any particular awareness that they were pawns in a war. To understand the Depression-era kitchen fully, you have to understand Crisco. And to understand Crisco, you have to go back a little further to a man named William Proctor and his brother-in-law James Gamble, and to a moment in the 1880s when the price of lard in the American market was doing something that threatened to make their soap business very uncomfortable indeed. Procter & Gamble had been in the business of making soap and candles since 1837, and their primary raw material was animal fat, which they bought in significant quantities from the meatpacking industry in Cincinnati. In the 1880s, Cincinnati was still the centre of American pork processing, and the fat from that processing was the feedstock for most of the soap and candle manufacturing in the region. This was a stable arrangement until it was not. When the price of lard began to rise, and when the electric light began to compete with candles in ways that made the candle business look increasingly uncertain, Procter & Gamble found themselves in the position of needing either a cheaper source of fat or a new product that could be made from a cheaper source of fat, or ideally both. The answer arrived through chemistry. In 1907, a Procter & Gamble chemist named E.C. Kaiser read a European scientific paper describing a process called hydrogenation, a method by which liquid vegetable oil could be transformed through the introduction of hydrogen under pressure and in the presence of a nickel catalyst into a solid fat. The process was not entirely new to European science, but its commercial applications in the American market had not yet been seriously explored. Kaiser recognized what he was looking at. He brought the idea to the company. Procter & Gamble, with a speed and decisiveness that suggested they understood the stakes clearly, began funding research immediately. The oil they chose to hydrogenate was cottonseed oil, which was at that moment cheap, abundant, and largely considered a waste byproduct of the cotton industry. Cotton had been king in the American South for a century, and the seeds of the cotton plant, heavy with oil, had been pressed, and the oil had been used for various industrial purposes, including as an adulterant in lard, a practice that was not entirely legal and not exactly unknown in the meatpacking industry. Cottonseed oil was inexpensive precisely because it was slightly disreputable, associated with fraud and with the margins of industry, rather than with the centre of American cooking. Procter & Gamble saw this as an opportunity. By 1911, they had refined the process sufficiently to produce a stable, white, odourless, flavourless solid fat from cottonseed oil, one that behaved in cooking in ways that were remarkably similar to lard, could be stored at room temperature without spoiling, did not carry the slight animal flavour that real lard sometimes imparted to baked goods, and could be produced at a cost that made it significantly cheaper than the animal fats it was designed to replace. They needed a name. They tried several, including Crist, which suggested the crystalline texture of the product, and went through variations before arriving at Crisco, a contraction that contained a reference to crystallized cottonseed oil, and that was short enough, clean enough, and unusual enough to be memorable. The name was tested on women in Cincinnati. The women found it acceptable. This was considered sufficient. The launch of Crisco in 1911 was not a humble affair. Procter & Gamble had been watching the household market long enough to understand something that their competitors in the lard and butter industries had not fully grasped, which was that the woman who cooked 3 meals a day for a family was not simply a purchaser of raw materials. She was an aspirant. She was a person who wanted to do her job well, and who responded to the idea that there was a scientific, modern, clean answer to the problems she faced in her kitchen. The advertising for Crisco did not simply say this is cheaper than lard. It said, this is cleaner than lard. This is purer than lard. This is what modern science has provided specifically for your modern kitchen and your modern family. It was an argument about identity as much as it was an argument about fats. Procter & Gamble sent free samples to virtually every grocer in the country. They sent promotional cookbooks, not small pamphlets, but substantial recipe-filled volumes with the Crisco name on the cover, to homemakers, to home economics teachers, to school cooking programs, and to newspaper food editors. The Crisco cookbook, published in 1912 under the title Tested Crisco Recipes, contained 250 recipes, every single one of which called for Crisco instead of lard or butter, and every single one of which had been tested by home economists employed specifically for this purpose, because Procter & Gamble understood that the authority of a tested recipe was considerably more persuasive than a mere advertisement. The cookbook was offered for free or at a nominal cost. Hundreds of thousands of copies moved through American households in the first few years. The success of this campaign was extraordinary. Crisco moved from novelty to kitchen staple in a time frame that surprised even the people at Procter & Gamble who had planned the campaign. Within 3 years of the launch, the product had become so embedded in American cooking that recipes that had never mentioned any brand name before began specifying Crisco by name, as if it were a category rather than a product, the way some people say aspirin when they mean any brand of the drug. Home economics programs incorporated it into their curricula. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Women who had never in their lives used anything but lard, who had rendered their own pig fat for decades, found themselves reaching for the blue and white can at the grocery store because it was clean and it was modern, and it did not go rancid and it cost less and it worked. Then came the Depression, and the Crisco story became something more complicated and more interesting. Because when incomes collapsed in 1929 and the years that followed, the economics of the American kitchen reshuffled themselves in ways that required every product to justify itself, not on the basis of modernity or cleanliness or anything aspirational, but on the basis of sheer financial value. Butter, which had always been the gold standard of American baking fats, became a luxury that many families could not reliably afford. Lard remained available, but its cost was not trivial. Crisco, made from the cheapest of oils, priced deliberately to undercut the competition, survived the reshuffling remarkably well. Procter & Gamble understood the moment. Their advertising during the Depression years shifted registers with a precision that demonstrates how carefully they had been listening to their customers. The aspirational language of the 1910s, the arguments about modern science and cleanliness, quieted. In their place came arguments about economy, about value, about what you could do with a can of Crisco that you could not do for the same money with anything else. New Crisco recipes appeared in magazines and newspapers, and on the sides of the can itself, recipes explicitly designed to stretch $1, to make a small quantity of meat feed a large family, to turn inexpensive ingredients into satisfying meals. Crisco did not merely survive the Depression, it became associated with Depression-era cooking in a way that made it feel indispensable, a thing you could not manage without. But the story of Crisco in the 1930s is not simply a story of corporate triumph, because it is also a story of what was not on the label, what the white, odourless, apparently benign solid in the blue and white can was doing in the bodies of the people who ate it. The hydrogenation process that turned liquid cottonseed oil into a solid fat produced something called trans fats, partially hydrogenated fatty acids that the human body was not particularly well designed to process, and that decades of subsequent research would eventually connect to elevated risks of heart disease and other chronic conditions. In 1934, none of this was known. In 1934, Crisco was modern, clean, economical, and entirely unexamined from a health perspective, because the science that would eventually examine it did not yet exist in a form sufficient to raise a question. The women who used Crisco in the Depression years were not naive, they were not fooled. They were making rational decisions based on the information available to them, which was that here was a stable, affordable fat that worked well in their kitchens, and that their children would eat without complaint. The failure of information was not their failure. It was the failure of a system that had moved faster than its own understanding, that had commercialized a chemistry before fully comprehending the chemistry, and that would continue to sell that chemistry to American families for the better part of a century before the health implications became clear enough to require reformulation. Procter & Gamble reformulated Crisco in 2004, removing the trans fats from the product in response to changing regulations and consumer awareness. The can still exists. The blue and white design still exists, modified but recognizable, in the kitchens of women who are grandmothers and great-grandmothers today, in the kitchens of women who learned to bake from women who learned to bake from the Depression-era generation. Crisco is still a name that carries a specific weight, a specific memory, a specific smell of something browning in a cast-iron skillet on a Tuesday morning when money was short and skill was what stood between the family and hunger. The Great Shortening Wars, as food historians sometimes call the competitive battles of the 1920s and 30s between lard, butter, and the various hydrogenated vegetable shortenings, ended without a clear winner because the market itself shifted and kept shifting, driven by price, by health claims, by marketing, by the changing availability of animal fats, and by the habits that had formed in the lean years when women who had no room for the wrong decision made the decisions they could afford. Crisco won the Depression not by being the best fat, but by being the most strategically positioned, the most aggressively marketed, and the cheapest reliable option in a decade when cheap and reliable were the two most important qualities a product could offer. There is something worth noticing in the fact that the product that won the Depression-era kitchen was made not from what farming families raised and processed themselves, as lard had been for generations, and not from what dairy farmers produced in the old collaborative economy of American rural life, as butter had been, but from the byproduct of an industrial crop processed by a corporation and sold back to the consumer in a branded can. This was not simply a change in fat, it was a change in the relationship between the American household and the food supply, a step further into the consumer economy, a step further from the self-sufficiency that had previously defined American domestic life. The Depression accelerated this step even as it seemed to call for a return to older, simpler ways. The old ways and the new ways were both present in those kitchens, sometimes in the same recipe, sometimes in the hands of the same woman, and the tension between them is part of what makes that decade's domestic history so layered and so worth sitting with. What the Crisco story ultimately illuminates is something that runs through the entire history of American domestic products, and the women who used them, which is the gap between what was claimed and what was true, between what the advertising said and what the label did not say, between the reassuring authority of a tested recipe and the unmeasured uncertainty of a chemistry that was newer than it seemed. The women who kept their Depression-era frugal habits long after the war, who reached for the Crisco can out of a trained economy of motion, even when the economic pressure had eased, were not irrational in their attachment. They were loyal to what had worked. They were loyal to what had gotten them through. The fact that the getting through had costs that were not listed on the ingredient panel does not diminish what they built or what they endured. It simply adds another layer to a story that was never as simple as the clean white contents of a blue and white can. The story of Crisco is, in the end, the story of an era in which chemistry met commerce and landed in the kitchen, and in which the women who ran those kitchens were asked to trust a system that was moving faster than its own understanding. Most of them did trust it. Most of them had no particular reason not to, and what they built from that trust, those meals, those habits, those particular ways of making a dollar work harder than it wanted to, was real, and it was theirs, regardless of what was or was not printed on the label of the can that sat, white and solid and eminently practical, on the pantry shelf through the longest and hardest years of the American 20th century. The home economics movement deserves its own place in this story, because it was the institutional infrastructure through which much of what we are calling frugal wisdom was given its formal shape and its professional language and its place in the curriculum of American public schools. Home economics as a formal discipline emerged in the late 19th century from the work of people like Ellen Swallow Richards, the first woman admitted to MIT, who spent much of her professional life attempting to bring scientific methods to the management of the household, to analyze the nutritional content of food, to measure the efficiency of cooking methods, to bring to the kitchen the same systematic rigor that the Industrial Revolution had brought to the factory. This was a serious intellectual project, and the women who pursued it were serious intellectuals, and the cultural condescension that the field later attracted, the reduction of home economics to a subject for girls who were not expected to do anything else, came later and was not inevitable, and was not what the field's founders intended. By the 1930s, home economics was a significant presence in American secondary education, taught in most high schools by women who held degrees in the subject, who had trained in the application of nutritional science and household chemistry and food safety and household accounting to the management of domestic life. The textbooks they taught from were updated regularly to incorporate new research, new products, and new understanding of the relationship between nutrition and health. The women trained in these classrooms went home and applied what they had learned to households that were under genuine pressure, and the application was real and measurable. The household that understood the caloric content of dried beans relative to their cost was the household that could maintain adequate nutrition on a minimal budget. The household that understood the chemistry of soap and water and fabric was the household that could keep clothes clean without buying more soap than it could afford. The irony of the home economics movement, and it is a real irony, is that it was simultaneously the most serious institutional acknowledgement the culture provided of the importance and complexity of domestic labour, and the primary vehicle through which domestic labour was defined as specifically female, as the natural province of girls and women rather than a set of skills that all people in a household might usefully share. The rigour of the discipline and its confinement to the female curriculum were not accidents, they were related. The culture was willing to take the management of the household seriously as a field of study, precisely because it was being assigned definitively to women, and the assignment definitively to women was partly a way of managing the field's influence, of ensuring that the knowledge and skill it represented did not expand beyond the domestic sphere into the areas of professional and public life where its practitioners might have had more power. The Crisco story does not stand alone in the Depression-era pantry. It has company, and one of its most illuminating companions is the story of powdered milk, which arrived in American households with something of the same combination of industrial necessity, corporate ambition, and genuine household utility that Crisco had delivered 2 decades earlier. Gail Borden had patented condensed milk in 1856, a product that had made fortunes during the Civil War, when the Union Army required a shelf-stable milk product that could travel without refrigeration. The condensed milk technology was the ancestor of a lineage of shelf-stable dairy products that the Depression generation relied on with the same matter-of-fact practicality with which they relied on the Crisco can. By the 1930s, the technology for producing dried whole milk and dried skim milk had advanced sufficiently that the products were commercially viable and aggressively marketed to Depression-era households as the rational economic choice for families who could not afford fresh milk daily, but who understood that children required the nutritional content that milk provided. The dried skim milk was cheaper than the dried whole milk, which was cheaper than fresh milk, and the hierarchy was transparent and deliberate. The most nutritious version cost the most and the least nutritious version cost the least, and the households with the least money to spend were therefore most likely to use the product with the least fat and the fewest fat-soluble vitamins, a nutritional irony that the marketing materials did not see fit to address. Women who used dried milk in the Depression years developed a set of techniques for making the reconstituted product more palatable, because reconstituted dried skim milk, mixed with water according to the package directions, does not taste like milk in any way that would fool a child who had ever tasted the real thing, and children then as now have opinions about this. The techniques included reconstituting the milk at double strength, and then diluting it with real milk when real milk was available, so that the result occupied a middle ground between the two products that was not quite either, but was more convincing than the pure reconstitution. Or mixing the dried milk into baked goods and cooked dishes where its flavour would be submerged in other flavours, so that its nutrition arrived hidden inside a biscuit or a pudding rather than visible in a glass. Or chilling the reconstituted milk very thoroughly before serving it, because cold suppresses the off flavours in a way that room temperature emphatically does not. These techniques passed between women the way the soap pressing technique passed, and the grease saving technique, and the bread stretching technique, not in writing, not in formal channels, but in kitchen conversations and back fence exchanges, and the quiet transfers of knowledge between women who were all managing the same problem with the same limited materials. The home economics movement of the era made some effort to formalise and document this knowledge, to move it from the informal kitchen conversation into the textbook and the classroom, and this effort was not without value, but it was also not without its limitations, because the formal documentation of informal knowledge tends to lose some of what makes the knowledge work, the specific judgment, the particular adjustment for this oven and this flour and this family's preferences, the stuff that lives in the hands rather than on the page. The question of which products required brand loyalty and which did not was one that Depression-era women negotiated constantly and individually, without the benefit of consumer research or comparison testing in any systematic sense, guided instead by experience and by the accumulated experience of the women they knew. The answer they arrived at, household by household and product by product, was not simple and not universal, because the performance gap between generic and name brand varied enormously by category, and sometimes by application within category. Salt was salt, baking soda was baking soda. Sugar differed only in how finely it was granulated, which mattered for some applications and not for others. Vanilla extract differed in ways that the tongue could detect with certainty in a simple application, and that became undetectable in a complex one. The name brand products that kept their household share through the Depression were the ones that had made themselves genuinely necessary through a combination of consistent quality and successful marketing that had created an expectation, a standard against which the generic was measured and found wanting. Campbell's soup was this, Heinz ketchup was this. The Heinz bottle had been in American kitchens since 1876, and the flavour of its ketchup had become, over those decades, not merely a flavour but the definition of the flavour category, the thing against which all other ketchups were measured, and the Depression-era housewife who switched to a generic ketchup to save a few cents was buying a product that her family would compare, unfavourably, to the standard, and the unfavourable comparison would arrive at the dinner table and require managing. And managing it was a cost she sometimes judged to be higher than the few cents the switch had saved. This was the genius of brand marketing, and it was not entirely cynical, or rather it was cynical in its execution and occasionally honest in its underlying premise. A brand that had consistently delivered quality had genuinely earned the expectation of quality, and the expectation was not irrational. The irrationality, if any existed, was in the cases where the brand had earned the expectation through marketing rather than through quality, where the name had become synonymous with a flavour profile that the generic could match precisely, but that bore the name brand's association so thoroughly that a blind tasting might have found them identical, and an ordinary tasting never would. The women who navigated this territory were navigating it without the tools that would later exist for navigating it, without consumer reports or comparison studies, with only their own tongues and their own families' reactions and the shared intelligence of the neighbourhood. Woolworths was not simply a store. In the Depression years, the five and dime occupied a position in the household economy that was strategic as well as commercial, a place where the small necessities of domestic management could be obtained at prices that fit within budgets that could not accommodate the full-service dry goods store for most purchases. The Woolworths model, the fixed low price, the open display, the self-service in an era when most retail still involved a clerk who stood between you and the merchandise, was perfectly suited to the conditions of the decade, to a shopper who needed to see the price before she decided whether she was buying, who needed to handle the merchandise without the social obligation of the clerk's attention, who needed to walk out with nothing if nothing was within her means that day. The sewing notions aisle at Woolworths was a particular resource. Thread, needles, buttons, bias tape, snaps, hooks and eyes, the small hardware of domestic repair, these were available in quantities and at prices that made the mending basket's contents a manageable expense even when the larger household budget was under significant pressure. A card of buttons for 5 cents, a spool of thread for 5 cents. The small units of purchase that matched the small scale of the domestic economy in its most constrained years, the ability to buy one thing at a time, exactly one thing, without a minimum purchase, and without the feeling that the transaction required a scale of spending you could not sustain. The women who shopped at Woolworths in these years understood the store's specific value with precision. They knew which items were the genuine bargains and which were merely inexpensive without being good value. They knew which brands the store carried and which were Woolworths' own label, and what the difference between the two was likely to be for any specific category. They knew the sales cycle, the timing of markdowns, the particular days and seasons when the selection was deepest or the prices lowest. This knowledge was not provided by the store. It was accumulated through repetition, through the careful attention of shoppers who were spending money they could not afford to misplace. The connection between the products on the pantry shelf and the work that happened at the washboard is not accidental. It runs directly, because the soap in the wash basin and the starch on the ironing board and the bluing in the rinse water were all products in the same economy as the Crisco on the stove. Products that a woman was purchasing or producing at home, managing at a cost that required thought, stretching where they could be stretched, refusing to run out of because running out of soap on a Monday morning is a problem that cascades forward through the whole week. The domestic economy was not compartmentalized. It was a single continuous flow of resources and labor and management, from the pantry to the wash basin to the clothesline to the ironing board to the mending basket to the pantry again, and the woman at its centre was not managing a series of separate systems but a single integrated one, and her competence in managing it was the thing that held the household together through all the years it needed holding. You know what day it is before you open your eyes, not because you have looked at a clock or heard a particular sound, but because your body has recorded the week's rhythm the way a draft horse records the shape of its harness, through repetition so thorough that the knowledge lives in the muscles before it reaches the mind. Monday is wash day. Your body knows it is Monday. Your body has opinions about this. The alarm sounds at 5, not a clock alarm because your alarm clock stopped working last spring and you have not replaced it, but the internal alarm that comes from going to bed every Sunday night with a list already running, a list that starts with the water, because on wash day the water is the first problem and the first problem must be addressed before anything else can begin. You lie in the dark for exactly the time it takes to remember all the pieces of the day ahead, which is about 30 seconds, and then you get up. The wash boiler has to be filled. You do not have running hot water in any useful quantity, which means the boiler, a large oval vessel of galvanized steel that sits on the back burner of the stove, must be filled from the cold tap and heated from scratch, and this process takes time, and time on wash day is the resource you are most carefully managing, more carefully even than soap or money, because a wash day that runs long bleeds into Tuesday, in ways that Tuesday cannot absorb without complaint. You fill the boiler with a pitcher, back and forth, 3 trips to the tap because the boiler is large and the pitcher is not, and you do not rush the trips because rushing with a full pitcher leads to spills, and spills on wash day are a small specific misery that you're not willing to add to the larger general misery of the morning. The fire is already burning. You built it up before you went to bed last night, banking it carefully so that there would be something to start from this morning, because on wash day a cold stove is a delay you cannot afford. The boiler goes on. The water begins to heat. You stand near it for a moment, because the kitchen is the coldest room in the house at 5 in the morning, and the boiler is the warmest thing in it, and you allow yourself this much before the day requires you to begin moving at the pace it requires. While the water heats, you sort. The sorting is not arbitrary. It is a taxonomy developed over years of washing, a hierarchy of fabric and colour and soil that determines the order in which things go into the water and the length of time each category requires. Whites first, always. The white things, the sheets and pillowcases and the good shirt your husband wears to church, these go into the hottest water with the most soap, because they can take it, because the purpose of white fabric is to be genuinely white. Not an approximate white, not a white that has developed a faint undertone of grey from years of insufficient washing, but an actual clear legible white that announces itself when it comes off the line. You take the whiteness of the whites seriously. You have always taken it seriously. After the whites come the light-coloured cottons, the everyday shirts and blouses and children's wear in pale blues and yellows, things that need hot water but not boiling water, and that need careful attention to collars and cuffs, which are the places where the day accumulates most honestly, where sweat and grime and the evidence of work leave their marks most visibly. After that come the dark things, the navy dresses and brown work pants, which go into cooler water to prevent fading, handled with a care that is not excessive but is real, because a pair of work pants that has faded to an indeterminate brownish grey is a pair of work pants that looks poor in a way that you're not willing to announce more loudly than you have to. And at the end come the really dirty things, the work clothes that have been down in the coal, or up in the garden or otherwise engaged with the physical world in ways that require a category of their own. The washboard comes out. You do not own a washing machine, and this is not a tragedy, this is simply the state of things, though you have looked at the illustrations in the Sears catalogue with a particular kind of attention that is not quite longing and not quite planning but something in between, a theoretical consideration of a parallel life in which the washboard is not your Monday morning. The washboard is a piece of corrugated zinc set into a wooden frame, and the zinc is cold under your hands, and you have learned to manage the cold the way you manage most physical discomforts. By beginning, because cold zinc under knuckles is merely uncomfortable when you start and becomes unnoticeable after the first 15 minutes of work, at which point other discomforts have presented themselves to occupy your attention. The soap is Fell's Naphtha, a yellow bar with a sharp medicinal smell that you associate so completely with wash day that the smell alone, if you encountered it anywhere else in the world, would transport you back to this kitchen, this boiler, this particular quality of Monday morning light. You grate a portion of the bar into the hot water and watch it dissolve, contributing its yellow-green tint to the water that is already beginning to cloud with the surrender of the first load of white things. The smell fills the kitchen. It is not an unpleasant smell, or rather it is not unpleasant in the way that something familiar is not unpleasant. Even when it is technically harsh, it is the smell of work beginning. It is the smell of Monday. You work the first shirt against the board with a rhythm that is fast and even, and that has been calibrated over years to apply exactly the right amount of pressure and friction without tearing the fabric, because a torn shirt is a shirt that needs mending, and a shirt that needs mending on top of a shirt that needed washing is a compounding of demands that you prefer to avoid. Your knuckles move across the zinc, the fabric goes back and forth, the water darkens slightly, even with the whites, even with things you would have sworn were already clean, and this always mildly surprises you. The demonstration that nothing is quite as clean as it appears, that there is always something more to release. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The wringing is the hardest part on your hands. You wring by hand because a wringer would require an investment you have not made, and wringing by hand requires a grip and a twisting motion that, sustained over the course of a full Monday's wash, leaves your hands aching in a very specific way by afternoon, a deep ache in the joints and the web of muscle between thumb and forefinger that you have come to think of simply as Monday hands. Your hands on Tuesday look different from your hands on Sunday. The skin is rougher, the knuckles are redder. You apply petroleum jelly at night, which helps, and which also constitutes your entire beauty regimen for the hands, which is the extent of what you have time and money to offer them. The rinsing requires clean water, which means more trips to the tap, more heated water from the stove, the management of a second basin alongside the wash basin and the boiler. You have a system. You always have a system. The system involves the two largest basins you own, one of which is doing double duty as a rinse basin and a collection point for wrung-out things waiting for the second rinse, because one rinse is not always sufficient to remove all the soap, and soap left in fabric makes it feel stiff and look slightly dull, and you do not do stiff and dull if you can help it. By 8 in the morning, which is when the children leave for school on the days school is in session, you are halfway through the wash and your back has registered its formal objection. The objection takes the form of a pulling sensation in the muscles on either side of the lower spine, the muscles that spend Monday bent over the wash basin, which is set at a height designed, it seems, specifically to catch the back in the worst possible position. You straighten up periodically to address this. You put your hands at your hips and arch back slightly, which helps in the immediate term and contributes nothing to the long term, because the long-term solution would be a wash basin, set at a different height or a different kind of washing apparatus entirely, neither of which is available to you today. You eat standing up, a piece of bread spread with the thin end of the butter, eaten in about 3 bites over the course of a minute, not because you are particularly hungry. Wash day suppresses appetite in a way you have never been able to explain, but because eating is a maintenance task on the same level as adding water to the boiler, a thing the body requires in order to continue functioning at the pace the day requires. You do not sit down. Sitting down on wash day before noon is the beginning of a negotiation with time that you always lose. The line is in the yard. On clear days, this is the best part of wash day, the moment when you carry the basket of clean wet laundry outside into whatever the morning has decided to offer and begin the hanging. You have opinions about hanging. You hang sheets folded over the line so they dry with a crease that reduces ironing. You hang shirts by the shirt tail, never by the shoulders, because hanging by the shoulders pulls the shoulder seams and introduces distortion that no amount of ironing will fully correct. You hang matching socks together, pinned at the cuff, so that matching them later requires no sorting. These are not large decisions. They are small decisions that accumulate over the course of a wash day into something that looks like order, that makes the second half of the day's work slightly more manageable than it would be without them. The smell of clean laundry on a line is one of the specific pleasures of your work that you are willing to name. It is not a soft smell or a complicated smell. It is clean in the most straightforward sense of the word, a smell that is the absence of the grime and sweat and accumulated domesticity that the laundry carried into the boiler an hour ago, replaced by something that is just fabric and sun and moving air. You stand at the line sometimes for a moment longer than the hanging strictly requires. The sheets move in the wind. The morning is not warm, but it is not cold either. This is yours, this moment, this particular small reward, and you take it. On wet days, everything comes inside. The laundry strung on lines through the kitchen and the back bedroom, turning the house into a damp landscape of drying things that takes twice as long to dry as outdoor laundry, and that fills every room with a particular clammy smell that is not quite mildew and not quite clean, and that makes the children grumble in a way you cannot quite argue with. Wet wash days are the test. Everything takes longer, the water you heat must work harder, the drying requires more management, and by afternoon the kitchen is simultaneously too warm from the stove, heating water, and too damp from the wet laundry, and you're moving through both conditions at once while also beginning dinner, and also managing whatever the children have brought home from school in the way of demands and small disasters. The ironing does not happen on Monday. This was a thing you decided years ago on the basis that wash day and ironing day are two separate physical demands, and that combining them into one day would produce a result that was inferior in both categories. Ironing is Tuesday. Ironing has its own rhythms, its own requirements, its own particular physical demands and small satisfactions. Monday is washing. Tuesday is ironing. The division is as firm as any principle you hold, and you hold it the way you hold the washboard, with both hands and without apology. By 2 in the afternoon, the line is full and the wash basin is empty and the boiler is cooling, and your back has filed its complaints with every authority available to it and been overruled. You sit down, finally, with a cup of tea, and you look at the yard through the kitchen window at the white things on the line, which are genuinely white, which are the best argument available to you for the expenditure of this morning's considerable effort. The sheets move, the shirts move, everything out there is clean and it is drying, and tomorrow it will come inside and be folded or ironed or put away, and sometime next week it will be dirty again, and sometime the week after that it will be Monday again, and you will do this again, because this is the work, the actual work, the invisible backbone of a household's functioning, and you are the one who does it. What the women who did this work understood, and what the domestic science movement of the era was only beginning to put into formal language, was that the labour of laundry was skilled labour. It was not unskilled work that any person could simply do. It required knowledge of fabric, of temperature, of chemistry, of the behaviour of different dyes under different conditions, of the structural vulnerabilities of different garments, of time management across a full day of sequential and overlapping physical tasks. A woman who did her family's laundry well for 20 years had learned a body of knowledge that was real and specific and acquired at cost, and the cost was every Monday since she started. The cost was a Monday morning that began before sunrise, and a back that registered its complaints by early afternoon, and what she had to show for it was a clothesline full of white things that were genuinely white, and a household that functioned, quietly and reliably, because she had built it that way. You fold the dry things before dinner, because folded things take less space, and because there is a satisfaction in folding that the raw pile of laundry does not offer. Each thing goes flat in your hands and becomes, through a series of practiced folds you execute without looking, a neat rectangle that stacks with the others in the basket. The sheets take 2 people to fold properly, and your oldest daughter knows this and comes when you call her without being told twice. Because she is 12 and she's been learning the laundry since she was 9, and the folding of sheets is one of the things she can now do correctly, and correctly is what matters. You hold 2 corners, she holds 2 corners, you step together, fold, step again, fold again, and the sheet becomes a small flat thing that will fit on the shelf. 4 times you do this. 4 sheets, 4 sets of pillowcases, the bed linens are done. There is something in the discipline of a wash day that the women who did it did not name as discipline, because naming it would have required stepping back from it in a way the day did not permit. But it was a discipline, as rigorous as any other. It required physical endurance and sustained attention, and a systematic approach to a complex sequence of tasks, and it produced a result that was legible and necessary, and unmistakably the product of skill. The Depression did not invent this discipline, it sharpened it. When soap was rationed and water was considered, when every use of hot water had a cost that could be calculated, the skill of doing laundry well became even more evident as skill, because waste became visible in a way it had not been in easier years, and avoiding waste required exactly the kind of knowledge that this work had always demanded. The children come in from the yard as the light changes, as the afternoon tips toward evening, and you put the folded laundry away while they wash their hands and argue about things that are not important, and fill the kitchen with the ordinary noise of being alive, which is a noise you would notice more, you think, if it were absent. The house smells of clean laundry and something beginning to cook on the stove, and the day is winding down in the particular way that Mondays wind down, which is slowly and with a residual ache in the back and the hands that will not fully resolve until sometime Tuesday afternoon, and which is also, in its own way, the smell and feel of a thing properly done. The water itself is a subject of ongoing management that the laundress monitors the way a farmer monitors soil, with attention to its qualities, its behaviour, its specific character in this location and this season. Your water is hard, which you know not from a test but from the way the soap behaves in it, the way it forms a curd rather than lathering freely, the way the wash basin develops a ring of mineral residue that you have to scrub away with something acid. Hard water requires more soap. More soap costs more money. The response is borax, which you add to the wash water to soften it, not in large quantities, not expensively, but consistently, because the borax in the water makes the soap work better and therefore makes a smaller amount of soap do what a larger amount would otherwise be required to do. This is applied chemistry in the service of household economy, and it is knowledge that was given to you not by a chemistry teacher, but by your mother, who learned it from hers, and who would not have called it chemistry but would have recognised immediately that it worked. The question of what to do about a garment that has been damaged beyond mending is one that the Depression-era laundress approaches with a different set of tools than the question of what to do about a garment that needs washing. A garment that is beyond mending is not waste. It is raw material. It is entering the next stage of its useful life, which may be as a cleaning cloth, as a patch for something else that needs patching, a stuffing for a pincushion, or a draft excluder, as the fabric that gets cut into squares and saved for a quilt that may or may not materialise in the next 3 to 5 years, but that will use these squares if it does. Nothing leaves the household in the form of trash that can leave it in any other form. The trash can is for the things that have genuinely exhausted every possible form of use, and the things that genuinely exhaust every possible form of use are fewer than you might expect in a household run this way. You have a reputation in the neighbourhood for clean laundry. This is said without irony and without condescension. In a community where the quality of a woman's laundry was legible, and was read as a marker of the household's management and the woman's competence, a reputation for clean laundry was a real social asset, a form of standing that was not dramatic and was not publicly proclaimed, but that was present in the way people spoke to you and asked your advice, and sent their daughters to watch how you managed the Monday wash. You do not perform this knowledge, you exercise it. The distinction is important to you. Tuesday is ironing day, and the distinction matters more than it might seem to someone who has never organised a week around the demands of clean laundry. The ironing requires everything that wash day, dried and folded and stacked. Requires it damp, actually, requires a specific degree of dampness that makes the iron work rather than fight the fabric, and the science of this dampness is something you know in your hands before you know it in your head. Too dry and the iron drags and leaves marks and fails to smooth the deep creases. Too wet and the iron steams unevenly and you risk scorching, because the water becomes steam too fast and the steam is hotter than it looks. The right dampness is a thing you test with the back of your hand before you commit the iron to the fabric. Your iron is a flat iron, heated on the stove, not an electric iron. The electric iron is available, you have seen it in the Sears catalogue, you have used one at your sister's house, and the difference it would make to your Tuesday is not small. But the electric iron requires an outlay that is not where the household's limited discretionary budget is going this year, or probably next year, and in the meantime the flat iron heats on the stove and does the work, which is the work's only requirement. You have 2 flat irons so that one can be heating on the stove while you use the other, a rhythm of work and heating that keeps the process moving without the long pauses that a single iron would require. You test the iron's heat on a piece of cloth you keep specifically for this purpose. A scrap of old sheeting that has been serving as the test cloth for 4 years and that shows the evidence of its service in a variety of small brown marks that are the record of irons that were slightly too hot, which is the error you prefer to the error of too cool, because a cool iron does nothing useful, and a slightly too hot iron leaves a mark that is usually small and usually on a seam allowance or hem that will not be visible in the garment's final use. You have become extremely accurate at the temperature test. Your 4-year scrap cloth is relatively unmarked. The ironing board is a plank stretched between the backs of two chairs. You have seen ironing boards that fold out from the wall or that stand on their own legs, and these two are in the catalogue and these two are not in your budget, and the plank between the chairs serves the purpose. Padded with a folded blanket and covered with a piece of canvas that you replace every year or so, when the canvas has absorbed enough of the summer's ironing to have developed a permanent slight brown cast that transfers to white fabrics in a way you dislike. The replacement canvas costs 30 cents, and the old canvas becomes a dust cloth, and this is the life cycle of household goods in your kitchen. Everything becomes something else before it becomes nothing. The collars and cuffs first. Always collars and cuffs first, because they are the visible architecture of a garment's presentation, the parts that a stranger sees and reads as either tended or neglected, as either smooth and clean and pressed or soft and wrinkled and suggesting a household that is losing its grip on the details. A man who goes to work with a pressed collar is a man whose household is managing. A man who goes to work with a wrinkled collar is a man whose household is either struggling or careless, and you are neither, and the collar announces this. You press it with careful attention, working the iron around the curve of the collar stand, getting the points flat and sharp, and when the collar is done, it is visibly done, and the garment it belongs to is elevated by it. The starch is applied before ironing, because starch applied to dry fabric and ironed creates a stiffness that holds through the day in a way that unstiffened fabric does not. You make your own starch from the cooking water of potatoes and rice, saved specifically for this purpose, strained and cooled and kept in a jar in the pantry. It works as well as the commercial starch in your assessment, and it costs nothing because it is the byproduct of cooking that would have been poured down the drain in a different kind of household. You do not pour things down the drain that have a use. The drain is for water, everything else is for use. Laundry in these years is not entirely a private affair, because laundry hangs on lines visible to anyone who passes through the back alley or looks across the fence, and what hangs on a line is a kind of public record of a household's condition. Women read each other's lines with a knowledge that is not intrusive and not malicious, but is simply the accumulated literacy of people who live closely together and who understand what the lines are saying. A line of white things that are genuinely white says one thing. A line of things that are approximately white says another. A line with mended things, neatly mended, says something different from a line with things that needed mending and did not receive it. Nobody talks about this. Nobody is required to talk about it. It is a reading that happens automatically, the way you read a face for mood before you have decided to read it. You're proud of your line, not ostentatiously, not in a way you would name if asked, but in the quiet interior way of a person whose work is its own visible result, and who has opinions about whether the result is good. Your things are white, your mending is invisible, your sheets hang with the precision of things hung by someone who knows how sheets should hang. This is not accidental. It is the product of the Monday that preceded it, and the Tuesday that is happening now, the product of the knowledge in your hands and the organization in your head and the endurance in your back. The line is the visible evidence of all of that. You are allowed to be proud of your line. The women who take in laundry for pay are doing a different and harder version of this same work. Taking in laundry, the formal arrangement by which a woman accepts the dirty laundry of a household that can afford to pay for the service and returns it clean and ironed for a weekly fee, was one of the primary means by which women in the Depression years supplemented household income without leaving the home, without requiring childcare arrangements, without advertising their availability in ways that might suggest to the neighbourhood that things were worse than they were managing to present. The fee was small. The work was the same work you do every Monday, multiplied by the number of households you were serving compressed into the same number of hours, because the week has only so many Mondays. The women who took in laundry were not thought of within their own communities as doing something beneath them. They were thought of as managing, as practical, as making use of a skill and a facility they already had, as running the math correctly by turning necessity into income. The same calculation that led you to barter a loaf of bread for shoe repairs led them to offer Monday and Tuesday as services available for hire. The work was already being done. The knowledge was already present. The question was only whether it could be made to earn. Friday afternoon has a different quality than Monday. By Friday, the worst of the week's physical demands have been met, the laundry done, the ironing done, the major baking done, the accounts in their current state of order, and what remains of Friday afternoon before the week turns toward the weekend's different rhythm is a window of time that belongs to the finish work, the final pressing of things that will be worn to church Sunday, the last of the mending, the preparation of the household for the slightly different register of the weekend. You press your husband's church shirt on Friday afternoon with an attention that you do not give to his work shirts, because the church shirt is the formal presentation of the household to the congregation and to the neighbourhood and to the God who presumably has opinions about collars, and you do not come to church with a poorly pressed shirt if it is within your power to prevent it, and it is always within your power to prevent it if you have managed Friday afternoon correctly. The shirt comes out of the ironing looking like a different garment from the one you held up before you started, smooth and crisp and formal in the way that formal things justify themselves by looking formal, by announcing through their appearance that the effort was made and the standard was met. Your own dress for Sunday is pressed on Friday too, the blue one with the white collar that has been your church dress for 3 years, still sound, still presentable, still capable of being pressed into a shape that reads as intentional and cared for. The collar of this dress is removable, which is one of the reasons you purchased it, because a removable collar is a collar that can be washed more frequently than the dress without washing the dress, which extends the interval between full dress washings and therefore extends the dress's useful life, which was a practical calculation at the time of purchase that has vindicated itself through 3 years of Sundays. The dress is clean, the collar is white. You will look, on Sunday, like a woman who is managing because you are a woman who is managing, and the dress is simply one of the ways this fact is made visible to the world. The photographs from the Depression era have a particular quality of optimism to them. The ones that were not taken by documentary photographers looking for evidence of hardship, but the ones that appeared in magazines and newspapers and advertising materials, the photographs that were intended to show what American life looked like rather than what it cost. In these photographs, the kitchens are clean, the women are composed, the tables are set with a neatness that suggests order as the natural state of things rather than order as a daily performance maintained against considerable resistance. The faces are forward-facing, the posture is upright, and the impression is of a life that is managing, that is coping, that is perhaps even thriving, the famous American resilience wearing its public face. What these photographs did not show was the cost, not the financial cost, which was visible enough and which the documentary photographers recorded with unflinching clarity, but the biological cost, the psychological cost, the cumulative cost to the bodies and minds of the women who ran these households through a decade in which every resource was stretched to its limit, and the person responsible for the stretching was also responsible for not letting the stretching show. This was the hidden work of the Depression, the work of maintaining the performance of sufficiency while managing the reality of scarcity, and it left marks on the women who did it that did not appear in any of the official images. The nutritional picture of Depression-era households is one that researchers began examining seriously only decades later, when the generation that had been children in those years began to show patterns of health in middle age that prompted questions about what they had eaten between 1930 and 1940. What they had eaten, it turned out, was often not enough, and what was not enough was distributed unevenly within the household in ways that were systematic and largely invisible. The practice of mothers eating last, eating least, and eating the worst of what was available was so widespread that nutritionists who studied the Depression later described it as a defining feature of the decade's household economy. The cultural script was clear. You fed the worker first, because the worker's physical capacity was the household's primary economic asset. You fed the children second, because children were the household's future, and because a child who was visibly malnourished was a kind of social exposure that women in these years worked hard to prevent. You fed yourself from what remained, and what remained was often the heel of the bread, the thin broth after the meat had been taken, the slightly off apple that no one else had chosen, the oatmeal scrapings from the bottom of the pot. This was not considered sacrifice in the dramatic sense of the word. It was simply how things were done. It was the logic of household resource allocation in conditions of genuine scarcity, and it made a certain cold economic sense, and it also quietly depleted the women who practiced it across a decade in ways that no one was officially measuring. The deficiencies were real. Iron deficiency, which produces fatigue, cognitive fog, and a physical heaviness that is easy to dismiss as ordinary tiredness, was common among Depression-era women and quietly underreported. because the symptoms resembled so closely the ordinary symptoms of overwork that neither the women themselves nor the doctors who occasionally saw them were likely to flag it as a medical condition rather than a personal one, a matter of constitution rather than nutrition. Calcium deficiency, which attacks the bones and teeth over time, worked slowly and was not visible until it was significant. Vitamin deficiencies of various kinds expressed themselves in the skin and the hair and the quality of sleep and the resilience of the immune system, and all of these expressions were again easily attributable to stress and overwork and the general conditions of the era. The teeth are one of the most honest records of this history. The dental health of women who lived through the Depression as adults shows patterns that are distinct from the patterns of their husbands, and, in some documented communities, distinct from the patterns of their children. The calcium demands of pregnancy and nursing, occurring against a background of calcium-poor nutrition, extracted a price from the bones and teeth of women who went through multiple pregnancies in these years, a price that had a name in the medical literature of the period. It was called the calcium loan theory. The understanding that a pregnant body would borrow calcium from the mother's own skeletal structure if dietary calcium was insufficient, and that multiple pregnancies in rapid succession would borrow sequentially from an account that was never fully replenished. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. This is not a story that appeared in the household magazines of the era. The household magazines of the era were concerned with recipes, with management, with the cheerful challenge of making less go further. They published tips on how to use vegetable cooking water in soup, how to make a chicken feed a family twice, how to keep a household running on a reduced budget. They were, in their way, genuinely useful documents of frugal technique. But they did not publish articles about what sustained caloric restriction did to the women who practiced it, or what cumulative calcium deficiency looked like at 50, or what the psychological weight of being permanently last in the household's resource queue did over time to the interior life of a woman who was also responsible for maintaining the visible emotional stability of that household. The psychological dimension of this history is perhaps the least documented and the most consequential. The emotional labour of Depression-era housekeeping was not simply the labour of managing a difficult household with limited resources. It was the labour of managing the emotional experience of every person in that household, while simultaneously suppressing any overt expression of your own. You did not cry in front of the children. You did not let your husband see the extent of your anxiety. You did not tell your neighbours how close to the edge things were, because your neighbours had their own edges to manage, and because the maintenance of the appearance of managing was itself a form of social protection, a way of holding your family's dignity in a world where dignity was under considerable pressure. The women who practiced this emotional management were doing something that psychologists now recognise as a significant form of labour, work that has real cognitive and emotional costs, that depletes real reserves, that requires real resources to sustain. In the Depression years, it was simply expected. It was not named, not compensated, not acknowledged as work in any formal sense. It was simply the job of being the woman in the household, which included keeping the household's emotional climate stable under conditions that made stability genuinely difficult to maintain. Some women broke. This is the part of the Depression record that appears most rarely in the official histories. The women who cracked under the accumulation of years of insufficient food and insufficient sleep, and insufficient acknowledgement of what they were doing, who developed what the era called nervous conditions and what later generations would understand more precisely as anxiety disorders and depression, and the specific form of exhaustion that comes from performing emotional labour continuously without relief or recognition. The rates of hospitalisation for women with nervous conditions rose during the Depression years, and the diagnosis was frequently described in terms that pointed, beneath the clinical language, at the conditions of women's lives in those years, at the tiredness that was not ordinary tiredness, at the weight of a decade of performing sufficiency in the face of scarcity. What is equally important to understand is that most women did not break, and that the not breaking was also real and also cost something, and also left marks. The women who came out the other side of the Depression with their households intact, with children who were fed and clothed and educated, with marriages that survived the pressure, with a set of frugal habits so deeply embedded that they persisted for the rest of their lives, these women had done something remarkable, and the remarkable thing had a cost that was paid quietly and internally and without ceremony. The habits that persisted after the war are the most tangible record of this cost. When prosperity returned in the 1940s and 1950s, when rationing ended and the consumer economy began to expand with the extraordinary energy of the post-war boom, the Depression generation of women did not simply relax into abundance. They could not. The habits were too deep, too structural, too much a part of the way they moved through time and through kitchens to simply switch off because the external conditions had changed. They continued to save the grease. They continued to press the soap ends together. They continued to eat last and least, even when there was enough for everyone to eat well, because the body and the mind that had learned scarcity in its bones did not unlearn it at the announcement of the end of scarcity. Their daughters found this puzzling. The women who grew up in the post-war suburbs, in the ranch houses with the new refrigerators and the new appliances, looked at their mothers' habits and saw them sometimes as charming eccentricities, and sometimes as a failure to understand that things were different now, that you did not have to save the rubber bands from the celery, or rewash the wax paper, or refuse to throw out a piece of food until it had passed through every possible incarnation of usefulness. What the daughters could not always see was that these habits were not merely practical, they were protective. They were the behavioural embodiment of a knowledge that the Depression had taught with such force and at such cost that the lesson had become literally habitual, literally below the level of conscious decision. The coffee can on the back of the stove still full of saved grease in 1955, in 1960, in a kitchen where the refrigerator was full and the pantry was stocked and the children were healthy and the war was over, that coffee can was a form of memory. Not conscious memory, not the kind you tell stories about. The other kind, the kind that lives in the hands and the body, that makes certain motions automatic and certain waste impossible, that keeps a woman reaching for the can even when the reaching is no longer strictly necessary, because her hands know something that her circumstances have not yet convinced them to forget. The legacy of this history is still visible in the ways certain generations relate to food, to waste, to the maintenance of reserves, to the emotional performance of adequacy. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the Depression generation sometimes encounter its echoes in their own behaviour, a discomfort with throwing away food, a habit of buying extras when prices are low, a physical difficulty with the kind of conspicuous waste that prosperity eventually makes routine, a sense, not always conscious, that abundance is temporary and that the practices of scarcity are worth maintaining against the day when they are needed again. This is not neurosis, it is inheritance. It is the long shadow of a decade in which the women who kept households together did so at a cost that the official record almost entirely failed to acknowledge. What the cheerful advertisements and the glossy magazine photographs and the cookbook covers with their gleaming Crisco-based cakes and their perfectly arranged table settings did not show was a woman whose back hurt and whose hands were rough and whose reserves, nutritional and emotional, were running on less than the recommended amount, managing a household that worked because she worked, that was stable because she maintained its stability at personal cost, that fed its members because she was perpetually, systematically, quietly last in line. She did not do this because she was asked to. She did it because the alternative was something happening to the children, or the marriage, or the household's ability to function, and none of those alternatives was acceptable to her. And so she made herself the last and least and ongoing sacrifice, quietly and without drama, in a kitchen that smelled of Felsnaptha and baking bread, and the particular quality of a decade's hard-won competence. The Depression ended officially with the war. The war brought its own deprivations, rationing of a different and in some ways more manageable kind, because it was rationing with a purpose, with a clear narrative of collective sacrifice rather than the grinding anonymous deprivation of an economic collapse. After the war came the boom. After the boom came the suburbs. After the suburbs came the appliances and the grocery stores and the two-car garages and all the bright specific imagery of American post-war abundance. And through all of it, in kitchens that were getting newer and better equipped every decade, the women who had learned frugality in the hardest school the 20th century had offered kept their habits, kept their coffee cans, kept their notebook columns of accounts, kept their tendency to eat last and save everything and prepare for the possibility that the abundance was temporary. Because they knew, in a way that their daughters and granddaughters did not quite know, that it could be, because they had lived in the world where it was. The frugal habits that Depression-era mothers never gave up were not simply practical strategies for managing a limited budget, though they were certainly that. They were also the physical record of a decade in which women bore a disproportionate share of the cost of economic collapse, in which the bodies and the emotional reserves of the women who ran households absorbed what the official economy could not absorb, and in which the competence and the endurance and the quiet ingenuity of those women kept families together, and households functioning through circumstances that were genuinely, not rhetorically, hard. The habits they kept were the habits that had kept their families alive. The keeping of the habits was the keeping of a certain kind of vigilance, a certain kind of readiness, a certain kind of knowledge that had been paid for in Monday mornings and grease cans and nutrient-depleted meals, and the ongoing performance of sufficiency in the face of its absence. It was real knowledge, it cost real things, and it lasted in some households long after the original conditions that produced it had passed into history. The shame is the part that the official record obscures most thoroughly, because shame does not show up in the statistics and does not appear in the photographs, and does not lend itself to the kind of formal documentation that historians rely on. But it was present. The shame of not being able to give your children what other children had, the shame of the patched dress and the mended shoe and the brought lunch versus the purchased lunch, the shame of being the family that could not manage what other families apparently managed, the shame that came from the gap between the official American narrative of possibility and prosperity and the lived reality of a household managing on too little. This was a constant companion for many women in these years, carried quietly alongside the competence and the determination and the genuine skill. The shame was not always proportional to the actual circumstances. Families that were genuinely managing, that were fed and housed and clothed, that were by any objective measure surviving the depression without catastrophic failure, sometimes carried as much shame as families that were in more serious trouble, because the shame was not about actual deprivation. It was about the gap between the expected and the actual, about being required to manage in ways that the pre-war prosperity had not required, about the visibility of the management in a culture that equated the appearance of sufficiency with its reality and the appearance of struggle with its moral cause. Women who are managing brilliantly, who are feeding their families on almost nothing and keeping them clothed and the household functioning and the accounts in order, sometimes felt only the shame of the gap rather than the pride of the achievement, and this is one of the deepest costs of the era and one of the least recorded. The pride was also real though, and it deserves its space alongside the shame, because the Depression generation of American housewives did something genuinely remarkable, and they knew it, even if the culture they lived in did not find the language to say so formally. They took the conditions of a collapsed economy, and they applied to those conditions a set of skills that were real and hard-earned and effective, and the households they ran were the basic units of social stability in a decade when social stability was under extraordinary pressure, and without those households, without the women running those households, the human cost of the Depression would have been measurably higher. This is not sentimentality. It is a statement about how societies survive catastrophe, which is usually through the unglamorous, persistent, skilled management of daily life by the people who are responsible for daily life, who in the 1930s were primarily women, and who did the work regardless of whether anyone acknowledged that the work was happening or understood what it cost. The habits that Depression-era mothers carried into the post-war prosperity were not abstract. They were specific, physical, and in many cases so automatic as to be below the level of conscious decision, executed with the same unreflective ease with which the body carries out any deeply practiced motion. Saving rubber bands from the celery was one. The rubber band had a cost, a fraction of a cent in the 1950s, and the rubber band was reusable, and the reuse required no effort beyond the initial saving. And so the rubber band went into the kitchen drawer with the other rubber bands instead of into the trash, and the kitchen drawer of a Depression-era mother's kitchen had a particular category of contents that her daughter's kitchen did not necessarily share. The small saved things, the twist ties and the rubber bands and the paper bags folded flat, and the pieces of string wound onto a spool that had once held thread. String is worth examining as a category. The Depression generation saved string. They saved it from packages, from butcher paper bundles, from anything that arrived tied, and they wound the salvaged lengths onto a ball or a spool and kept the ball or the spool somewhere accessible, and they used the string for anything that required tying, which in a Depression-era household was a wider range of applications than a more prosperous household might require. Because in a more prosperous household, you bought new string when you needed string, and you did not particularly need string very often, because you bought things pre-packaged and pre-tied and pre-arranged in ways that rendered the household's need for raw string minimal. In a Depression-era household, the string ball in the kitchen drawer was a real resource. In a post-war suburban kitchen, the string ball was an anachronism that the woman who kept it could not quite bring herself to abandon. The string ball is almost a metaphor, if metaphors were welcome in a chapter about things that are most powerful when they are treated as fact. It represents the category of behaviour that looks, from the outside, like a failure to recognise that circumstances have changed, but that from the inside is something more complicated. The woman who continues to save string in 1955, in a kitchen with a refrigerator and a washing machine, and a television in the sitting room, is not confused about the state of things. She knows the state of things has changed. She knows string is cheap. She saves the string anyway, because saving the string is not an economic calculation. It is a physical habit so thoroughly installed that removing it would require more active effort than maintaining it, and because maintaining it costs nothing, and occasionally provides a rubber band when you need a rubber band, there is no sufficient reason to try. The refrigerator was one of the post-war transitions that the Depression generation navigated with more complexity than their daughters might have expected. The refrigerator meant that the daily relationship to food could change, that leftovers could be held safely for longer, that the icebox's unreliable and expensive ice block could be replaced by a machine that produced its own cold and did not require management. The women who had managed iceboxes for a decade, who had learned the particular skill of maximising the useful life of a block of ice, of knowing which foods needed to be furthest from the cold and which needed to be nearest, of knowing when the ice was going and planning accordingly, these women adopted the refrigerator readily because it made their management easier, but they brought their icebox habits with them, because the habits were good habits, and they remained good habits even in the new appliance. They covered everything. They labelled containers with the date. They organised the refrigerator with the same logic they had applied to the pantry shelf. Oldest forward, newest back, expiring soonest in the most visible position, because a leftover that is invisible is a leftover that gets forgotten, and a forgotten leftover in a refrigerator is the same problem as a forgotten leftover in an icebox. It is food that went bad when it should have been eaten. It is a small failed economy, a small defeat of the system. The refrigerator was a new machine. The habits that ran it were old. The combination worked. The Depression generation's relationship to money was permanently altered in a way that their children's relationship to money was not, and this difference was a source of ongoing quiet tension between the generations in the prosperous decades that followed. The Depression generation had learned through direct experience rather than through instruction that money was not a reliable permanent feature of life, that it could contract suddenly and sharply and without warning, that the distance between sufficiency and disaster was shorter than it appeared in the good years. This knowledge, once learned through direct experience, was not unlearnable. It stayed. They did not trust banks the way their children did. The bank failures of 1931 and 32, in which millions of Americans lost deposits that were not insured and that were simply gone, had produced a generation of people who understood viscerally that a bank account was not the same as cash in hand, that the number in the passbook was a number that could become zero faster than reason would suggest, and that maintaining some portion of household savings in a form that was not dependent on an institution's solvency was a reasonable precaution rather than an eccentricity. The cash in the coffee can on the high shelf, the folded bills in the hat box, the small account at the savings and loan that was separate from the checking account at the main bank, these were not irrationalities. They were the practical applications of a specific historical lesson. They did not buy on credit if they could possibly avoid it. The instalment plan was available and actively marketed in the post-war years. The ability to take home a refrigerator or a washing machine or a television and pay for it in monthly installments that stretched the cost across a year or two, and the Depression generation was specifically resistant to this offer in a way that marketing professionals of the era found puzzling. The post-war consumer economy was built partly on the assumption that the Depression generation would join its children in embracing credit as a tool rather than a trap, and the assumption was partially wrong. The women who had watched their neighbours unable to make payments in 1932, who had seen the repossession trucks come for the furniture that had been bought on time in better years, who had managed for a decade without anything they could not pay for immediately, did not look at the instalment plan and see liberation. They looked at it and saw a familiar shape. The clothing relationship of the Depression generation was also permanently marked. The post-war fashion industry, expanding rapidly in the years after rationing ended, was producing ready-to-wear clothing in quantities and at prices that made the home sewing of garments less economically necessary than it had been throughout the 30s, and the youngest generation of post-war women was beginning to buy clothes rather than make them. The Depression generation continued to sew. Some of them sewed because they genuinely preferred it, because the fit and the quality of a carefully made garment exceeded what was available ready-made at the price points they were comfortable with. Some of them sewed because the habit was too deep to abandon. Some of them sewed because the fabric on the bolt was still, to their eye, the more fundamental version of the garment, the raw form more honest and more manageable than the finished thing hanging on a rack at a price they regarded with the same skepticism they applied to any expense that could be avoided through their own labour. The daughters of the Depression generation received a set of domestic skills and a set of domestic anxieties, and they did not always know which was which. The skill of canning, of mending, of managing a household budget with precision. These were real skills, transferable and valuable and made available through the ordinary transmission of mothers teaching daughters, whether or not the teaching was explicitly recognised as teaching. The anxiety about scarcity, the inability to throw certain things away, the discomfort with abundance as a permanent state, the reflexive preparation for the contraction that might come. These were also real, also transmitted, also present in the daughters' kitchens in the prosperous decades, though often in a diluted form that the daughters did not recognise as the diluted form of something their mothers had experienced at full strength. Some daughters found the frugal habits oppressive. This is worth acknowledging without judgment, because the experience of being raised in a household where waste was treated as something close to a moral failure, where the apple that was going soft needed to be used rather than thrown away, where the heel of the bread was always eaten even when the appetite for it was not present, could produce in children a longing for the ease of disposal that prosperity seemed to offer, the freedom to throw things away without guilt, to buy things without calculation, to live in a relationship with abundance that did not treat abundance as inherently temporary. The post-war consumer economy offered this. Many children of the Depression generation accepted the offer gratefully. Others found the habits a comfort, a stability, a way of feeling grounded in times of uncertainty, a set of practices that connected them to the specific competence of the women who had raised them. The woman who still makes her own bread in 1962, in a suburb with a perfectly good Wonder Bread delivery, is doing something that is neither economically necessary nor fashionable, and she knows it, and she does it anyway, because the bread is better when she makes it, and because the making of it is its own satisfaction, and because somewhere in the action of mixing and kneading and waiting for the rise, there is a connection to a mother and a grandmother, and a kitchen, and a decade that she does not want to completely lose even as the world it belonged to recedes. The most consequential silence in the official history of the Depression era is the silence around what it cost women specifically. The official histories of the Depression focus, as official histories tend to focus, on the large external events, the stock market collapse, the bank failures, the unemployment statistics, the policy responses, the political figures and their decisions. These things are important and they are well documented. But the unofficial history, the history of what happened in the kitchens and on the washboards and in the notebooks with their careful columns, the history of who absorbed the cost of the collapse into their bodies and their labour and their management, this history was for a long time almost entirely absent from the official record. The domestic science movement made some effort to document the labour of homemaking in economic terms, to argue that the unpaid work of the household represented a real and calculable contribution to the national economy, and to suggest that ignoring this contribution in the official measures of economic activity produced a systematically misleading picture of who was doing what and at what cost. These arguments were made with varying degrees of success, and were received with varying degrees of seriousness, and they seeded a tradition of scholarship that would eventually produce the field of feminist economics and the serious academic study of household labour. But in the 1930s and 40s, these arguments were largely marginal to the official conversation about the Depression and its costs. What was not marginal was the experience of the women who lived it, and the traces of that experience are everywhere in the record if you know how to read them, in the bones and the teeth of the women who survived it, in the habits that persisted into prosperity, in the specific reflexes and resistances of a generation that had learned things at a cost that did not go away when the conditions that produced it did. The Depression left its record in the bodies and the behaviours of the women who managed it, a record that was not written down but that was transmitted anyway, through the specific texture of a kitchen that ran without waste, through a coffee can on the back of a stove, through a notebook in a drawer, through a clothesline full of things that were genuinely white on a Monday afternoon in a decade long enough past to have become history, but close enough still to feel like inheritance. And there it is, the thread that runs through everything we have visited tonight. If you follow it back from where we are now, from whatever room you're lying in, with your phone or your lamp or your soft electronic light, back through the post-war suburb and the Depression, and the washboard Monday and the blue and white Crisco can and the notebook with its careful columns, the thread leads you to a woman in a kitchen, and the kitchen is cold, and she has been up since before the sun committed to rising, and she is doing what people have always done in conditions that require more of them than conditions strictly should. She is making do. She is finding the path through. She is eating the oatmeal scrapings from the bottom of the pot, and drinking the pale third-use tea, and adding today's numbers to her notebook, and taking exactly the moment she's allowed at the clothesline, where the sheets are moving in the cold morning air, and calling it enough. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. What we carry from the Depression generation into our own lives is not always easy to see clearly, because the distance makes it look like habit when it is actually knowledge, or like eccentricity when it is actually the residue of a decade in which the specific practiced ways that women moved through kitchens were the difference between a family that held together and a family that did not. The Crisco can sat on the shelf in kitchens for decades after trans fats became a known concern, because the hand that reached for it had learned to reach for it in the years when reaching for it was the right answer, and the body does not simply unlearn the right answers when the problem changes. The coffee can of grease stayed on the back of the stove long after bacon grease was no longer the most efficient flavouring available, because the hand that tilted it knew what it was doing, and knew what it had done, and saw no reason to stop doing it just because the supermarket now offered alternatives. The notebook stayed in the kitchen drawer through decades of relative prosperity, because a woman who had once navigated a family through 10 years of genuine scarcity with the help of a pencil and a careful column knew what the pencil and the column were worth. The laundress who stood at the washboard on Monday knew something. The woman who pressed the soap ends together knew something. The mother who ate last and kept the accounts and banked the coals at night and got up before the house to check on them knew something. What they knew was not romantic. It was not the subject of the magazine covers or the advertising copy, or the cheerful recipe pamphlets that Procter & Gamble sent to every grocer in the country. What they knew was the specific physical, unglamorous shape of a life built on the refusal to waste, the refusal to break, the refusal to let the household sink under conditions that had been designed by no one in particular, and that fell with their full weight on the person who was last in the resource queue, and first at the stove every morning. There is something worth pausing on in that, in the gap between the official image and the lived reality, in the distance between the smiling woman on the cookbook cover and the woman behind the washboard, in the space between what the photographs showed and what the bodies recorded. That gap is not a reason to feel angry on behalf of women who have been gone for decades, though some anger would be understandable. It is an invitation to look more carefully, to take seriously the work that was not named as work, to acknowledge the cost of what was built by people who were not given the resources they needed, and who built it anyway, out of competence and necessity, and the particular human stubbornness that refuses to let the household fail, even when the world outside it is doing its best to make failure seem inevitable. Tonight we spent time inside the daily routines of a woman who learned to make a kitchen work on what the Depression offered. We followed the corporate story of Crisco through its brilliant, complicated, ultimately problematic rise to become the defining fat of the 20th century American kitchen. We stood at a washboard on a Monday morning and felt what that particular skilled labour actually cost, and we looked at what the official images carefully excluded, the biological and emotional price of sustaining a household through a decade that asked everything of the women who ran those households and offered very little in return except the chance to keep going. The frugal habits that those mothers kept, the ones that their children found charming and their grandchildren find quietly remarkable, were not quirks of personality or failures to update with the times. They were the permanent physical record of a knowledge acquired at cost, the body's own note to itself that scarcity is real, and that preparation is its own form of protection, and that the coffee can on the back of the stove is worth keeping, even when the crisis that created it has passed, because the crisis that created it was real, and the woman who kept it through the crisis knows something about crises that the people who came after her do not have to know, and that knowing is a form of love passed forward in the most practical possible language, the language of not throwing things away, of planning ahead, of making do, of being ready. Let that settle now. Let the kitchen on the other side of this evening go quiet. The coals in the stove are banked. The bread is wrapped in its cloth. The notebook is closed. The woman who ran this household today is finally in the chair by the stove, her cup of pale tea going slowly cool, her back registering its familiar Monday complaints, her hands rough and capable and at rest for this one small hour that belongs to her and to no one else. The house is breathing around her. The children are asleep. The work will begin again tomorrow. For now, there is just this: the warm kitchen, the quiet house, the small domestic planet she has kept in orbit through another day, in a decade that asked everything she had to offer, and she is still here, and the household is still here, and that is the whole and sufficient accomplishment. That is enough. That has always been enough. Sleep well. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.